Welcome to the Worldshapers, conversations with authors about their latest books. I'm your host, Edward Willett, and this episode's guest, Shaun Hamill, talking about his new dark fantasy novel, The Dissonance. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Worldshapers, the podcast where I talk to other authors about their latest books. My name is Edward Willett. I am myself an author of many books, including 12 novels for DAW Books. My most recent one for DAW is The Tangled Stars, which is a far future outer space science fiction adventure that features an AI-uplifted talking cat who becomes a starship captain. Bit of a spoiler there. That came out in late 2022 in ebook and audiobook. It's available everywhere, as are all my books, both nonfiction and fiction. There's a few you probably can't find anymore, but a lot of them are still out there. I'm also a publisher. My publishing company is called Shadowpaw Press, named after our black Siberian cat, Shadowpaw. And I publish science fiction through there. I publish other stuff as well, but let me just show a couple of the most recent ones. This is the biggest one here. I always get that backwards. There we go. Robert J. Sawyer, The Downloaded. That's his 25th novel. He's a Hugo and Nebula Award winner. And this came out originally as an audiobook with Brendan Fraser in the cast. So I'm very happy to have the rights to that. You can find that wherever you find fine books. More recently, I have published 3 middle grade spooky story books, I guess you'd call them, starting with, these are all by Arthur Slade, who's a Governor General's award-winning author from right here in Saskatchewan. This is Return of the Grudstone Ghost. You can see that great cover, which is by Elaine M. Will, who's also a Saskatchewan native and artist. Then we have Ghost Hotel, another spooky story. The first two, as you can tell, both involve ghosts. This one's set in Saskatoon. The first one is set in Moose Jaw. And then we have a science fiction one, The Invasion of the IQ Snatchers. This is set in Nanaimo, BC, and as you can see, actually involves Nanaimo bars, which if you are Canadian, you know exactly what that is. Those are my 3 most recent releases within the science fiction fantasy genre. There is also a new book by Dave Duncan, the late great Canadian science fiction fantasy author, a science fiction novel called The Traitor's Son. And in August, there'll be the last book he wrote before he died in 2018 called Corridor to Nightmare. It's a fantasy novel, and that's coming out from Shadowpaw Press in mid-August. We'll be launching it at When Words Collide, the writing conference in Calgary. I also want to mention this one. This came out in January, so it's a little older, but I like to mention it because this is Shapers of Worlds Volume 4, the 4th in a series of anthologies I've kickstarted featuring authors who were guests on the podcast. This one had Sherilyn Kenyon in it, and Michael Brent Collings, David Boop, and Lavi Tidhar, just a great lineup of people. I'm in it too. And illustrated as well by Calgary artist Wendy Nordell. Volume 5 was successfully kickstarted earlier this year, and I'm working on the stories now. And the artist is working on the illustrations. It will be out to backers this fall, probably late this fall, and will go out to the general public in January. Shadowpaw has several science fiction novels coming up this fall. Just lots of great stuff. So if you'd like to check out Shadowpaw Press, it's at shadowpawpress.com. And there you can find about everything that I am publishing with my cat's picture on the spine. See, there he is, Shadowpaw. Oh, it's even bigger on the back. Shadowpaw right there, where my other thumb is. That one. It's always hard to do that when you're used to looking in a mirror. But there he is. Okay, enough of that. So let's get on to this episode's guest. And this one is very interesting to me because we'll talk about it off the top, but we have an unusual connection that you'll find out about in a minute. But we're talking to Shaun Hamill, and let me read his little bio here. Shaun Hamill received his BA in English from the University of Texas at Arlington and his MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. His debut novel, A Cosmology of Monsters, was published in 2019. His fiction has appeared in Carve and Come Join Us by the Fire 2. His nonfiction has appeared at Crime Reads and Tor Nightfire. He lives and works near Dallas-Fort Worth. And yes, you'll see, we do have an interesting connection that we'll talk about when we talk to Shaun, which we're going to do right now. So Shaun, welcome to the Worldshapers.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I always try to start these things by finding connections, and we have the strangest connection I have yet encountered, in that I went to university with your parents at Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas, and not only that, your dad was one of the first people to publish me, and I can prove it because I have right here this little, carefully bound and high tech. It's probably, I don't know, probably Xeroxed, I guess, back in those days. Literary magazine, and it's called And a Story because everybody in it wrote poetry except me. I wrote a story, and so I was And a Story. So,
I mean,
so I
it's
was
in
really.
great shape. Yeah. It
Oh wow!
looks
Well,
like you took good care of it.
it's been stuck on a bookshelf for I don't know how long until I decided to pull it out. Actually, yeah, look, there's your dad even wrote the foreword. I see there's his signature on the bottom there. So Rick Hamill.
Oh my
So
goodness. If you ever feel like scanning that, I'm sure I would love to have a copy. But
I've
I'm just gonna put that out there.
it would be easily done. I should do it. I'll do that. I'll send you a copy. There you go.
I would love that.
However, that's not what we're here to talk about. We are here to talk about, let's talk about you. So you have a new novel coming out just after this goes live. It'll be, if the timing works, it'll be the Tuesday after this goes live on Sunday, the 21st. It comes out on the 23rd of July. So it's called The Dissonance. We'll talk about that, but let's start by talking about how did you end up doing this thing we both do, which is write crazy, made up, fantastical stories. How did you, tell me about yourself?
Well, I mean, if I'm being honest, it's something that's kind of always been a part of my life. Like, as you previously mentioned, both my parents are also writers, so they encouraged it from a young age. Um, I was always fascinated by, like, I think I was aware very young that the stories I was consuming were not just, uh, they didn't just pop into existence. There were people who actually wrote them, and I wanted that job. That seemed like the coolest job in the world. So it's something I've kind of been chasing in one form or another. It took me a while to settle on prose fiction. For a long time, I thought I wanted to get into comic books. And I also had a period where I was making short films with friends. But I took a really great fiction class in my last year of undergrad, and that sort of was where everything kind of cemented for me, as far as like, okay, this is my sweet spot as a storyteller. Like, this is I I'm having more success doing this than I had with the other things, so it's kind of been a steady trek from there on towards publishing novels and trying to it's not my primary career, but it's the one I care about most. It's not my day job, but
Sounds familiar.
yeah.
Did what did you study in university? Was it an English degree of some sort, or something related to
Yeah,
writing?
yeah. I majored in English, and I minored in creative writing. I went to the University of Texas at Arlington, and the creative writing minor had just been created when I started at UTA in 2005. And I was like, oh, that sounds fun. And I had a lot of great teachers, but it was really one in particular at UTA. She's still at UTA, Laura Kopchik, who like kind of, I think, saw in me like a kindred spirit, like somebody who took writing. Like, I was clearly not just there for a fun class, which a lot of people take creative writing classes for, and there's nothing wrong with that. But like, I think she could tell like I was really serious about it, so she like started recommending books to read and things like that, and that really changed my life and set me on the course towards like grad school and MFA programs and all of that.
I've talked to Joe Haldeman, and he used to teach science fiction writing at MIT. And he would have these MIT students coming in. They thought it was going to be an easy credit, and they were quickly disabused of that notion with Joe teaching the class. Yeah, it's just, if you really get into it, it's not easy. It's because you're never as good as you want to be. You're always trying to be better the next time around, and is the way I always found it.
Yeah, absolutely. And a teacher who takes you seriously will push you out of your comfort zone past the little tricks, whatever little tricks you've developed to like hide your deficiencies in the basics. Like they make you actually do the work to learn how to tell a story.
It's
And
also
yeah,
interesting hearing that it was so successful for you, because I've talked to many, your episode one, I don't know, 179 or something like that. I've talked to a lot of authors doing this, and it's the more than not have said that when they took a formal writing class, it was of very little use to them. And there are some, so you're kind of the exception to the rule almost from the people I've talked to.
so for the people you talk to, I'd be curious. is it because they're mostly speculative fiction writers and the teachers weren't especially helpful for
I,
people who wanted to dabble in genre?
I think that had a lot to do with it in many of those cases, yes.
I was lucky because Laura was like, you can write genre, but it needs to be character based genres because that genre fiction. So like you can write a sci-fi story, but it needs to be about the people. Because that's what I can actually teach you to do. I can't teach you how to do science fiction better, but I can teach you how to do fiction better. Does that make sense? Like, but yeah, I have heard stories about that, and I've been pretty lucky. I had more of that problem in grad school actually than I did as an undergrad.
Well, it's all the same toolbox that we're all working with. There are some specific weirdnesses about writing science fiction and fantasy, like having to explain the world and not overload the story with the explanation and all that kind of stuff. Because if you're writing, regular mainstream fiction, you don't have to explain every little thing about how the world works as you often
Right.
do writing fantasy. I assume you're a big reader of this stuff, and that's why you were drawn to it.
Oh yeah, very much so. I've always sort of, excuse me. I've always sort of been restless in terms of my reading. Like I've read a little bit of, I think the only like genre fiction I haven't like at least dipped my toes into is romance. And it's just nothing against it. It just hasn't been something that sparked my particular interest, but like horror, fantasy, sci-fi, literary, mainstream, like I've, sort of dabbled in a lot of it. I think a lot of my favorite stuff is the stuff that, Michael Chabon would champion as kind of dancing on the borders between genre and literary. Like writers like Jonathan Latham or Chabon or Karen Russell, like writers who have those really sharp, like linguistic skills, but also like clearly a deep love for the weird or the strange or, just genre elements. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love it. I also love a good just high fantasy. Like I'm a big Brandon Sanderson fan. So, like up and down the high, or I wouldn't say Sanderson's low art, but you know what I mean, as far as the market or MFA professors might be concerned. Like I love it all.
So you obviously were writing in school, and when did you start trying to get published? And how was your publishing journey?
That was a lot longer. I started submitting stuff to publications in high school because I read Stephen King's On Writing, and he said he started when he was like 13. So I was like, okay, well, I'm 17. I might as well get started. And of course I didn't. It was sporadic. I wasn't consistent about it, but once every 6 months or so, I would, dig out a copy of the Writer's Market and be like, okay, well, it says this market buys, this is back when it was a paper book. They buy sci-fi or whatever, and I would send something in. And I started as early as that. I got more consistent about it after college. So I was a 7-year undergrad. I didn't finish my bachelor's until I was 25, and I didn't publish my first short story until I was 27. But it won an award. I submitted it as a contest. It won second place in the 2010 Raymond Carver Short Story Awards. And that was pretty straight literary fiction. But then I published another couple of stories, but I was really working on a novel. And that was sort of where I was focusing my interest. And through the people I met, I was lucky that I didn't know this when I submitted, but the publication that published my first short story, Unpracticed Altitudes, they were actually based in Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I actually started spending time with them in person. I joined a writers group that they had, and they opened a lot of doors for me as far as exposing me to other local writers. And I read for Carr for a couple of years, which was a great education. In terms of you just see what's actually being submitted versus, like your favorite Ray Bradbury stories, which were published, 50 years ago or whatever, but you see what people are doing today, and you learn real quick what bores you and what catches your interest, and that applies to your work. But they helped me finish that novel, and I found an agent. And at around the time I got the agent, my then spouse, my ex-wife now, had finished her undergraduate work. So I applied to grad school and got in. And during my first semester, I lost that agent. She left the business. That book it never sold, but it did get me into my graduate program. And so I started a new book and found a new agent. And so I started that book in 2014 during my first semester at Iowa, and I sold it in 2017, right in like November. So about 18 months after I finished my MFA, and it came out in 2019. I'm not particularly prolific, so like it took me until I was 36 to publish my first novel, even though I started kind of pursuing this, at the age of 25. And it's there have been 5 years between the publication of that and my second book. So it takes me a while to finish stuff. I'm trying to speed up the process a little bit, but it definitely it did take some time, and I had some good luck and some bad luck that kind of got me where I am now, I guess.
So that first book was A Cosmology of Monsters.
Yes.
And had some very good reviews and good response, it seems like. Is the new book related to that in any way, or is it a complete standalone, different universe kind of thing?
Without giving too much away, it is in the same universe, but sort of silently so, meaning you don't have to have read Cosmology to understand it, to follow the story. Like there's no carryover, but there are some things that readers who are familiar with the first book will recognize. Just sort of quiet world building. I don't know if it's actually going to build to anything where the two will ever join concretely in a narrative, but definitely in that same space.
Well, this would seem to be, since we are talking about the Dissonance, this would seem to be a good place to give a synopsis without giving away whatever it is you don't want to give away.
Sure. So yeah, the Dissonance, I would call it a dark fantasy bordering on horror novel. It's about a group of friends who discover that magic is real and is based on the idea that there is something broken in the fundament of existence, a tension between how things ought to be and how they actually are, and that friction creates an energy which is called the dissonance, and that can be manipulated to alter the world around you, and it is because it does come from a place of brokenness. People who tend to be a little bit cracked are the ones who can actually use it. So people who maybe are mentally ill or just have a lot of trauma, outsiders, like they're not just anybody can do it. And you have to be somebody who's already a little bit, of an outsider to do it. So this group of kids who are all outsiders are kind of drawn together by this. And we track their adventures over the course of several summer vacations. And that's intercut with sections that are set in the present day, when the characters are all the surviving characters who are all adults have come back to their hometown to basically put the past to bed. There are some unquiet things that have started stirring, and so these broken adults have to come home and reckon with the past and finally put it to bed. So it's about friendship, and it's I'm getting a lot of in the early press comparisons to It in terms of the Stephen King novel, in terms of the split timeline, which fair enough. It wasn't intentional, but that book definitely was a big influence on me and is buried like deep in my psyche. So of course, even when I'm not trying to borrow from Stephen King, I think I will always be borrowing from Stephen King in some way or another. So, and I think that's fairly common for a lot of writers.
So this is the question you're not supposed to ask, which is, where do you get your ideas? But what was the seed from which this novel grew, and the one before it, for that matter? Is there a standard way that you tend to approach creating a new work?
No, it's a little different every time. I don't I don't have a surefire way of generating ideas. That's part of why I only have a couple of books to my name at this point. Because it took a while after I finished Cosmology, and part of that was because I didn't have anything in my back pocket by the time I published that book. I sort of froze up because a lot of the reviews were really nice, and I was like, well, okay. I got sort of paralyzed by my own success for a while, but I don't want
Not
to.
unusual.
Yeah. So a little bit of advice for anybody out there: always be working on the next thing while you're trying to sell or publish the other thing, or because don't be like me. But for this book, it was sort of interesting. I knew I wanted to write something a little more fantasy than horror. It took me a while. I felt like after Cosmology, I felt like, well, I'm a horror writer, so I should write a horror book. And I was really paralyzed by that because I felt like as a straight horror story at that point, I had said everything I had to say about the genre. But once I gave myself permission and kind of talked it through with my agent to sort of step in a slightly different direction. I think that the two books are more alike than unalike, but I think I needed to get over that in my head, that genre hump. I knew I wanted to. So my book Cosmology of Monsters sort of explores mental illness and broken people, and I kind of wanted to carry that exploration over from a horror space into a fantasy space. And I feel like one of the things that I've discovered through my life as a neurodiverse and mentally ill person is that sometimes those things can be a superpower. Like they can make you a little bit better than most people at certain things, but they also come with a heavy cost. And I thought that was a really interesting metaphor to explore. Because I have a lot of neurodiverse friends. We didn't know it. We weren't diagnosed as kids, but it all makes perfect sense now. It's like, this is why we were drawn together. This is why, it just felt like we were always speaking our own language. So I wanted to explore that. And the other piece of it was I started the book during COVID when I was self-isolating, and I was living in Alabama, and everyone I knew was living in Texas. And I was missing, so I was self-isolating. I wasn't seeing any human beings. I was one of the lucky people who got to work from home. I didn't have to, go out and be at risk. But it was terribly lonely, and I was missing my friends very much. And I think that plus this idea about brokenness and magic sort of just kind of came together pretty quickly. Once I had the idea, writing the book was actually pretty quick. Cosmology was a much slower process, whereas this one it didn't write itself, but it came pretty quickly once I had that.
So do you do a lot of pre-planning, outlining, or anything like that, or is it more of a general idea and then you just launch into it?
I kind of do half and half. So I do a little bit of planning at the outset. So for the Dissonance in particular, I wrote a full outline that was a few pages long, just to kind of give my agent and my editors an idea of what I was going for. And they were like, yeah, that sounds good. Go do that. And then I put that outline away, and I didn't look at it again until the book was done, because it was like, okay, I kind of know what I want to do. Once that was done, I, just writing from my memory of the outline and making changes where they seemed appropriate, I printed out the whole thing, read it, and then re-outlined that using index cards, and different colors for different point of view characters, to kind of figure out where people were appearing and disappearing throughout the narrative, to make sure I was balancing things and all of that. And figuring out okay, well, Erin's been gone for 50 pages. So maybe there's a chapter here, and figuring out okay, well, what part of the story can she play, and so on and so forth. So there's a little bit of planning, but I like to leave a lot of room for exploration and play, and to be surprised, because that was where a lot of the magic with my first book came in, was how often I was able to surprise myself and change direction. And what I have found is that typically, if I try to stick too close to an outline, nothing super interesting happens, and what I end up with isn't as good, for me. But that, for other writers, it may be the exact opposite, but that's how it
Well,
seems to work for me.
as I said, I've heard everything at this point.
Yeah.
From the people who start with a sentence and write a book, and I always mention Peter V. Brett, to Demon Cycle, very popular fantasy series, told me that he writes 150-page outlines and then just
Wow.
fills them in. So, there's and everything in between. I'm a lot like you. I write a synopsis, especially when I was selling from synopses. So, you had to have something that you could give to the editor, and they could say, "Oh yeah, do that." And then, like you, I tend not to look at it unless I get in trouble. Then sometimes I will look at it and see, why is this not working? And I had it figured out before, and now I screwed it up. So I do that sometimes. Do you have people that you share it with at some point, beta readers of some sort, or are you a lone wolf in that regard?
For this book, I only showed it to my agent, and once he was ready, my editors. With Cosmology, I started it when I was still a grad student, so I had a lot, and I was turning in pages for workshop in class, so I had a lot of eyes on at least the first half of that book. But as wonderful as my classmates and my teachers in grad school were, it's easy to get overwhelmed. Like I assume by like beta readers, you have a couple of like readers that you trust, right? And you do, you're not handing it to
but
right.
People that do use them.
Yeah. And it's not that there aren't people I don't trust. I guess it's just those people happen to be my agent and my editor at this point. I think I'm kind of a delicate flower, so I can only take so much. And like, if somebody I considered a close friend is like, yeah, this is garbage, like that might devastate me. So if my agent says it, it's like, well, he's, I mean, I consider him a friend, but also it's a business relationship. So like he's, it's a little different. So I think it's, your mileage may vary, but that's why I don't share a whole lot with people until, it's publication time.
Have you had the same editor for both books?
So technically the editor of the Dissonance worked on A Cosmology of Monsters, but she was the assistant to the editor of Cosmology. And so yes and no. Tim O'Connell was the editor of Cosmology of Monsters, and Anna Kaufman was his assistant, and the three of us got along great. We made a very good team on that book. But Tim moved on to a different publisher between Cosmology and the Dissonance. But luckily, Anna had become a full-fledged editor by then, so she was able to pick up, and I got to stay with Pantheon, who published my first book, and has just a great team, and I've had a really good experience with them. So like it was, I missed Tim, but it was great that Anna and everybody else was still there to work with,
What kind of things come back to you from the editing process to be revised?
Well,
I know what I get, so I'm always curious what other people get.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think, because it was a little different on both books. So on the first book, I think we experimented a lot more with adding and removing plot elements to see, like, I remember there was one scene in particular, which anybody who's read the book might know. It's like the scene that's kind of a hinge for the book, and it's one of the more controversial things in the book. And we almost didn't have it in the book, but we tried the book without it and realized the book wasn't working. So there was a lot of stuff like that, where it was like, how much do certain characters know at what points, and how does that affect the flow of the story and their relationship? So I would try something and it wouldn't work, and we would walk it back and then try something else. Whereas with the Dissonance, I feel like Anna and I had a clearer vision of what we wanted it to be, and most of the time was spent just trying to make the choices that got us there, instead of just trying things out and seeing what we ended up with. I think Tim was a little more experimental, and Anna and I were more like, well, we feel like this is kind of the arc of the book. I will say with Anna, I added a lot to the book. So the version that I sold was about 100,000 words, because that was the length of my first book, and I assumed, like, market wise, that's kind of the sweet spot, right? And we actually added an additional 40,000 words because the feedback I got was, this is just moving too fast. This is like, the pacing is great, but we need to spend time with the characters. And also, because I was so focused on just keeping the story moving and not letting it drag, you never really got to spend time with them as people. And it was really just like, here's one disaster after another, like all the big plot things were in place, but none of the fun, the moments that really make you fall in love with the people, you know, the just sitting around talking or hanging out or being friends. For a book about friendship, you need moments that actually show why these people care about each other. And so we added a lot of that, and that was really the arc. The other piece of it was, and this is an interesting difference between a horror book and a fantasy book, is in a horror book, you don't really have to explain anything. You can kind of leave it beyond the reader, you know, the character's comprehension. Whereas in fantasy, I mean, you can kind of do that, but there's more of a trope of like, well, we kind of need to lay out some ground rules for how magic works. So like, and the reader needs to kind of be aware of those so that they understand what's possible and what isn't, at least to some degree. I mean, you can still surprise them, but and because I am such an instinctive writer and I didn't have like this 20-page outline of like, well, here's how the dissonance works, you know, at a molecular level, we had to figure out like, okay, well, it was more like, oh, well, this seems like a cool story idea or moment or scene or twist. And then it's like, okay, well, now how do we make that make sense? How does that rule in chapter 2 fit with this rule in chapter 16? So there was a lot of backwards engineering. And if I ever get to do a sequel to this book, I'm definitely going to make sure that I have done a bit more of that homework before I start. Just so even if the reader doesn't need it, I think I need it, you know?
Yeah, I had a YA series, and I was just kind of making up the magic as I went, and it was a 5-book series, and somewhere around book 4, I really wanted the magic to work in a certain way and realized that I had already precluded the magic ever working that way from something I'd done in book 1 or 2. So, you know, it's a writing problem and you work your way around it. But yeah, it's like, maybe if I'd planned ahead a little bit more, that wouldn't have happened. So.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It's finding a way to ride that line, I guess, for writers like us, right?
So were you, that first book came out, and we already talked about how it was well received and kind of froze you up for a while. Were you startled by how well that first book was received? And pleased, I presume.
Yeah. I was very happy with it. I was really surprised how it went. I remember I had a hard time. So all my friends at Iowa, one of the things about the Iowa Writers Workshop, a lot of agents and editors come to Iowa. You know, they fly out from New York to meet the students because the program, you know, has produced a lot of, writers like Raymond Carver or John Irving, you know, people like Philip Roth and Kurt Vonnegut used to teach there. Marilyn Robinson was a teacher there when I was there. So like there's a lot of history and, good odds in meeting those people. But I was bringing this genre book, about monsters and haunted houses to these meetings. You know, I met with, I can't remember her name, but she was Jonathan Franzen's agent. And I was just like, wow, I'm meeting Jonathan Franzen. And she just looked at me like I was an alien when I was trying to pitch this book. I mean, she was nice about it, but it was definitely like, are you sure you're an Iowa student? Like, what are you talking about? And so I had all my friends were signing with agents. I couldn't get any interest. And I did find an agent. I got lucky. I met Kent Wolf, who was at that time at the Friedrich Agency, and now he co-owns his own agency, Neon Literary. And he got what I was trying to do and knew how to sell it. And he and I worked together for a long time. The first draft that I gave him was about double the length of the final published book. So like we did a lot of work on it. So I turned it into him in November of 2016 and we sold it in November of 2017. So like there was a lot of, I essentially cut half the book and also rewrote the second half of the story. And it all good work. Like I'm really happy with the shorter version of the book. I think it's much better. But I remember standing in the driveway with my ex-wife, who was then my wife, the weekend before we started sending it out to editors, and thinking and telling her, like, I don't think this book is going to sell. It's too weird. It's not scary enough for horror writers. It's not literary enough for literary readers. Like, it's kind of this weird, like, half measure thing. And the books that I was looking to as far as comps were indie horror titles, like small press type things. And so I would have been really happy. I had just read The Fisherman by John Langan, which, is this great horror, novel. And I was like, yeah, like that. And my agent was like, I mean, that's not a bad place to land, but let's try some of the bigger publishers first. And I was really surprised because we started getting feedback from editors like 3 days after we sent the book out. And that is pretty unusual. Usually you wait a little while because editors have too much to do all the time. Everybody does. But yeah, people were lining up for phone calls. So I actually got to talk to a lot of different editors. And at the end of the process, we got to go to auction with the book, and I got to choose where I wanted to publish. And I didn't go with the biggest offer financially. I went with with Tim O'Connell and Anna Kaufman and Pantheon, because that was where I felt the connection. So that by itself was really surprising, that I sold it to a branch of Penguin Random House, because, Pantheon's owned by Knopf, who's owned by Penguin Random House. So, like, essentially an arm of the biggest publisher in the world had bought my weird little horror book. So that by itself was really startling. And then all along the way, it was just more good surprises like that. Like getting the Stephen King blurb was a huge, like, that was not something I was not anticipating that. Like when they asked me for a list of who I, would want blurbs from, Stephen King wasn't even on the list, because I was like, there's no way, like, let's not even waste our time. And my book's publicist, Abigail Endler, was like, give me a shot at it. And I was like, okay. And yeah, we got really lucky with that. And yeah, like the good reviews, the readership, I think like all of that was really exciting and wonderful. And I got to go on tour. Like I was one of probably the last book tours before COVID. So like, and I'm about to go on tour again for the new book, but tours in a post-COVID world look a little bit different. They're a little lower budget, because I think publishers figured out, and rightly so, that, events, virtual meetings, stuff like what we're doing here, like, can save a lot of money and still reach a lot of people. Although it is really nice to get to go to a bookstore, especially an indie bookstore, although I love the chains too, and meet readers in person, and that's really cool. But yeah, one of the nice things about this is that the book also, it wasn't like a bestseller or anything like that. It didn't hit the New York Times list. But it still seems to be finding readers 5 years later. I know a lot of books kind of just disappear. And, especially first novels, like they tend to come and go pretty quickly. I mean, and the average, novel sells very few copies. And Cosmology continues to sell. Like, I haven't been monitoring the sales numbers like I used to, but like it was low but consistent for years and years. And I still will hear from new readers who found it, and that has been really lovely. Like that the book is still alive at this point, 5 years later. And that people were still interested when I finally got another book in the can, and from all accounts, most people seem to like this one even better, which is also a surprise. So like my whole career is just surprising.
You certainly have some nice advanced reviews, which will appear on the website where this appears. Obviously, you can't see it on the YouTube channel, but it'll be in, well, actually, you will be able to see it in the descriptions when I put it on there, the text that I put. So it'll have the reviews underneath this video.
Oh, nice.
To take a look at it, those sort of advanced blurbs there. So what are you working on now?
So right now, I'm actually juggling a few different things. So earlier this year, I turned in my first licensed fiction, which is, in somebody else's IP, which is something I've wanted to do for a long time. I really loved movie novelizations and tie-in books as a kid, so it's a fun place to play between original novels. So I did that, and I just turned in a preliminary outline for another one, which I'll hopefully be writing later this summer. And I've got outlines for 2 original novels with my agent for him to kind of pick from as far as what my next piece is. I've been doing some nonfiction stuff to support the release of the Dissonance, some essays to kind of, just try and get the word out a little bit. 2 of those have been placed. There's a third one that's still kind of up in the air, so we'll see if anybody wants it. And I've actually started writing short stories again, which I haven't done in a long time. I don't know. It's just been kind of a nice like palate cleanser while I get ready to write the next novel. I've been really lucky this summer to kind of have a burst of like creative energy that I haven't had in a while. I think a lot of people, I was kind of walking through the COVID fog for a couple of years there. And, so I'm trying to make hay while the sun shines. So maybe it won't be another 5 years before you hear from me again. So just trying to stay busy, doing a lot of different stuff.
And where can people keep up with you online?
I am on Twitter, or X, I guess it's called now, a lot. Facebook, Instagram. I'm on Threads. I don't check it as often as I should, but those are the main places.
Is it all Shaun Hamill?
Yeah. If you just do at Shaun Hamill, yeah, you should. Find me pretty easily.
That's easy. Mine are all over the place because I started too soon at all this stuff, and now I've got different handles for just about everything. Edward Willett when I can, but I'm like E. Willett on X and Edward Willett Author on Facebook, and no, Edward Willett on Facebook and Edward Willett Author on Instagram and Thread. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know the math on it, but I would guess based on our 2 names that there are more Edward Willets than there are Shaun Hamills in the world. So I'm a little lucky in that respect that even when I get somewhere late, I can usually get that handle.
Well, I don't want to brag, but I will. That I believe I'm at least the first 2 full pages of Google results are me. If you do,
hey, all right.
Well, thanks so much for being on, Shaun. It was great chatting with you, and best of luck with the release of the new book.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
And thanks again to Shaun for that great conversation. I still can't believe that out of the blue, I found myself talking to the son of somebody that I knew very, very well at university. And I did not know that when I arranged for the interview. It came to me through his publicist. And I thought, Hamill, I wonder if he's related to Mark Hamill. I didn't think he might be related to the Hamills I knew in university. So yeah, that was very fun to discover that connection. All right, that's it for this episode. A few things just to remind you of. You can find me at edwardwillett.com. You can find me, as I said to Shaun, somehow I've got all of my handles are all over the place. I'm at edwardwillett.com. That one is straightforward. Then I'm also at eWillett on X. I'm at edward.willett on Facebook. I'm at Edward Willett Author on Instagram. I'm on Blue Sky, and I'm on Threads, and I'm on YouTube, as you can see, at Edward Willett, youtube.com/Edward Willett. And I feel like I'm forgetting something, but I'm out there. LinkedIn, if you're curious, I'm on LinkedIn as well, and various other places. So yeah, look me up if you'd like to know about my personal writing. For Shadowpaw Press, that one's much easier. Shadowpaw Press is at shadowpawpress.com. It's on X at Shadowpaw Press, on Instagram at Shadowpaw Press, and on Facebook at Shadowpaw Press. And the Worldshapers itself is at theworldshapers.com, where you will find links and more artwork and things like that for each interview. They're all on there. There's also direct links to the audio-only version, as well as a link to this video version, since I went to video at the beginning of this year. So check that out as well. The Worldshapers is also on X at The Worldshapers and on Facebook at The Worldshapers if you want to keep up with the new interviews coming out there. That's it, I think. So thank you again for watching. There'll be another interview like this of an author from the larger world of authors. Then I'll be doing some interviews with the authors I'm publishing through Shadowpaw Press this fall and taking a bit of a hiatus then. I don't know if I'll be back or not, but I hope I will. I'll let you know later. But yeah, for now, just keep on coming back. There's going to be several more interviews before I take that hiatus. And if I do disappear for a while, it doesn't mean I'm dead, just so you know. So thanks for watching, and I hope to talk to you again next time. Bye for now.